it's strategic stupidity. There's absolutely no strategic vision in the US. They're alienating all of their allies.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to independent security analyst and foreign policy expert / journalist Jimmy Rushton, who's based in Kiev and has been for the last 3 years. He spoke to us about what the feeling is like on the ground in Ukraine, especially in the last few weeks when the negotiations between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have started, how they feel about potentially the ending of the war, if they trust the US to broker this deal, and if they trust them to give Ukrainians what they need and what they want. And we've also spoken to him about the US siding with Russia in this UN General Assembly, which was a pretty insane thing to do. So all that today on the Trump Report. So don't forget to watch us on our Times Radio YouTube page, or you can stream it as a podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Jimmy Rushton, Kiev-based security analyst and foreign policy expert, and the occasional journalist, thank you for joining the Trump Report today. It's so exciting to have you on in such a pivotal time of this kind of hoping to transition into a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. But I want to start quite timely. The US yesterday voted with Russia at the UN General Security Conference when it comes to the fact that they said that Russia wasn't to blame for invading Ukraine, and they didn't vote alongside the rest of their allies when it came to a resolution for peace and the withdrawal of Russian troops. What was your reaction to that moment?
Well, it's extraordinary, really. The majority of Ukrainians view it as legitimizing the Russian occupation of their country, because the amendment that the US attempted to vote down, because it actually passed in the end in the UN General Assembly. The amendment called for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and recognized Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the US voted alongside Russia, voted alongside Belarus, North Korea, Hungary, Israel, to deny this resolution. So it's kind of extraordinary seeing the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, lining up with these autocracies, these dictatorships, to legitimize the Russian occupation of a European country. It's bizarre, and it did not go down well in Ukraine at all.
Yeah, I can imagine it would have caused a bit of chaos on the ground in Ukraine. But that vote, Jimmy, literally felt like a backflip. If you have told anyone covering the invasion of Ukraine that this would have happened even a month ago, no one would have believed that the US would have sided with Russia in this vote. Did it seem like the US has completely turned its back on Ukraine in that moment?
Yes, to be honest. It feels to Ukrainians like any pretense that the US was on their side or was an honest broker has disappeared. This is obviously combined with this minerals deal that Trump wants Ukraine to sign. The continued lies that Trump is repeating about US military aid to Ukraine, saying something around 500 billion. It's nowhere near that. It's significantly less than the European Union and the UK have supplied to Ukraine. So all these lies, calling Zelensky a dictator, and then refusing to call Putin a dictator when he was meeting Emmanuel Macron in the White House. It seems clear to Ukrainians that this guy is not on their side, and it's even sadder in a way, because Ukrainians were willing to give Trump a chance. Ukrainians heard Trump talking about peace through strength, and they liked that idea. They were actually one of the more optimistic European nations about Trump's coming presidency, but he has destroyed any goodwill that he might have had in Ukraine, and the reputation of America is just at its lowest level in Ukraine at this point.
On the ground, when you're walking around and you're doing a lot of interviews and you're talking to people in Ukraine, I mean, you've lived there for 3 years now. How has the state of the way Ukrainians are feeling compared to even a month ago?
So, if anything, it's made Ukrainians more determined. It's solidified a lot of support around Zelensky. Ukrainians, regardless of what Trump seems to think about Ukraine, it has a relatively vibrant free press, and Zelensky is criticized quite a lot in Ukrainian media, on social media. But when it comes to an outsider criticizing Zelensky, saying Zelensky is not legitimate, that's something that rubs Ukrainians up completely the wrong way, because Zelensky is the elected leader of Ukraine. He enjoys the support of pretty much every party in the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament. Even Zelensky's key political opponents like Poroshenko and Zelensky despise each other, but Poroshenko would never say that Zelensky is not legitimate, because he is. And the lies that again, more lies that Trump told about Ukraine, that Zelensky has cancelled elections. He hasn't cancelled elections. The Ukrainian parliament has imposed martial law in Ukraine, and under the Ukrainian constitution, which Zelensky did not write, elections cannot be held legally. So, it's solidified Ukrainian support around Zelensky. It's reinforced the determination of Ukrainians to really not have their future dictated to by a foreign power, whether that's the United States or whether that's Russia.
And you can understand that, but no one on the ground is calling for an election of Zelensky, right? There's no actual Ukrainians believing that an election needs to be held.
No. Everyone understands that if there was to be an election held, firstly, you'd have to lift martial law, which would destabilize the country at a critical time. There would also be a lot of, division, because elections are naturally competitive, right? So you would have, you'd have different political parties, different presidential candidates attacking each other, which would cause division amongst Ukrainians. It's exactly what they don't want. Again, Poroshenko, Zelensky and him do not like each other, but Poroshenko is absolutely clear. Elections should not be called until the conflict is over and martial law is lifted. So, no demand for elections, and just practically speaking, how do you call elections? How do you hold elections? How do you hold hustings when the country is under near constant bombardment? How do soldiers vote? How do people in the occupied territories vote? How do refugees vote that are outside Ukraine? How do you make sure that the electoral process is secure from Russian, interference? These are all questions that are, incredibly difficult to answer. And obviously, any effort that is put towards holding elections is effort that can't be put towards the war effort. So, no appetite for elections here at all.
Absolutely, and not even over that. It's expensive to hold elections, and Ukraine doesn't have money to burn right now. But I want to get into this $500 billion minerals contract that Trump sent Zelensky. Now, Zelensky said that he refuses to sign it. But then the update is that the contract is apparently now in its final stages of negotiations. We're not quite sure what Zelensky has put forward and what Trump has signed off on, but I can imagine we would know in the coming days. But while this is occurring, Jimmy, Russia and the US will enter the second day of negotiations today. They started last Tuesday. They've got another one today, where it was quite a bizarre situation when Steve Witkoff was on TV saying that couldn't really answer what Russia's concessions will be, what Russia will have to give up in these negotiations. So on one hand, you have Zelensky spending the last few weeks negotiating this minerals deal with the US, and then on the other hand, the Trump administration can't tell us what Russia will be giving up in order to broker this peace deal. So it kind of looks like from the outside world right now that Russia might be getting off scot-free and Ukraine is the one giving up things. Is that your interpretation of what's been happening?
Absolutely, and it's the interpretation of the majority of Ukrainians as well. I mean, Trump talks about the art of the deal, but his administration has been giving up, concessions to Russia from day one. They've been talking about how, no NATO, potentially pulling NATO troops back from Baltic states, from Poland, and legitimizing Russia's conquest of Ukraine. So again, like you said, Russia's not really being asked to give up anything, and it seems that the Ukrainians are being asked to accept the Russian occupation of significant parts of their country. And here's the thing, Ukraine cannot be forced to do a deal. The Ukrainian military, and I was at the front about 2.5 weeks ago, the Ukrainian military is not on the verge of collapsing. They are holding the line pretty well. The Russians are advancing in some areas, but they're advancing at a very, very slow rate. They're taking astronomical casualties. Look at the Russian army right now. They're literally sending soldiers on crutches to do assaults. And there's multiple cases of this documented by both the Ukrainians and the Russians themselves, because generally when Russian soldiers complain about something, the way they do it is they record a video, they upload it to their Telegram channels, they say, hey, we're being treated appallingly by our officers, can someone help us, right? So we know that this is happening. They've been reduced to using donkeys to, carry out logistics operations because the Ukrainians have destroyed so many of their trucks. And again, this is easily confirmable. You can go on Russian social media and look at the videos of this. Ukrainian drones are killing huge numbers of Russian soldiers, destroying huge amounts of Russian equipment. And again, this is not an army that's just going to conquer Ukraine. Even if the US pulled all support tomorrow, Russia would still, not be able to conquer Ukraine. It's a vast country. They have a huge army, even now, and they are determined to resist.
I guess in the last day or so, Donald Trump wrote on social media that he's in serious discussions with Putin about not only ending the war, but also entering into some economic developments, transactions between the US and Russia. We know that Russia's economy has been dwindling. It's kind of the saving grace in this from Ukraine's perspective, because they've swindled all their money into financing this war. So why would the United States be wanting to get into these economic deals with Russia and try and boost its economy when that was the leverage that they had?
Well, it makes no sense from a strategic perspective. But the problem is that there really isn't anyone in Washington that thinks from a strategic perspective anymore. I mean, it's the last thing that you'd want to do at this point. You would not want to throw the Russian economy a lifeline, because they are, as you rightly say, under severe pressure. I think it's as simple as the Russians dangled large numbers in front of Donald Trump's nose, and he's not a sophisticated thinker. He just thinks like a businessman from Queens, and he sees large numbers and believes the Russians when they say, oh, you can make a lot of money if you do deals with us, and that's the motivation there. I really don't think there's any strategic thought about this subject at all.
And then on the other hand, you've had Australia, New Zealand and UK all place further sanctions on Russia this week. It does seem like there is a massive divide right now in the way that each country is handling the aggression of Russia. Do you think that the rest of these countries, these NATO allies or ones on the outside like Australia, should be enforcing more sanctions, more tariffs on Russia at this time? Or is it kind of rocking the boat a bit at a time when we're hoping to negotiate a general peace deal that would end the war?
Well, on a personal level and from a strategic perspective, I think the West should absolutely be putting as many sanctions on Russia as possible. Russia will only end this conflict when they think it's in their economic and strategic interest too, right? And at the moment, Russia thinks broadly that they can outlast the West, especially now Trump has done this 180 in regards to Russia. So they, the more pressure we can put on Russia, the more likely they are to come to terms. If they think that they can outlast the West and outlast Ukraine on the battlefield, they have no, there's no motive for them to come to terms. There's no motive for them to give up anything. And that's the problem, again, these unilateral concessions that Trump is making, and he's not asking for anything in return from Russia. He's just saying, hey, yeah, we'll do this for you and we'll do that for you, and you should come back to the G7. And it's clear from obviously in Moscow, they must be looking at this and rubbing their hands in glee, because he's outperformed their wildest expectations. They thought he was going to be good for them, but they didn't think he would be this good. They didn't think he'd be this pro-Russian and be getting nothing in return for it.
Yeah, it is a peculiar situation we're in. But Jimmy, on the third anniversary of the war, China and Russia held phone calls where Xi Jinping basically said that they have a no limits relationship now with Russia. Trump considers China his biggest competitor, his biggest rival. How dangerous do you think this situation is now for Trump to know that his biggest competitor is also massive allies with someone he's also cozying up to? It doesn't look good for him.
It doesn't. I would say that this no limits friendship relationship that China and Russia have definitely does have limits. For example, you aren't seeing Chinese lethal military aid to Russia. You're not seeing Chinese tanks, Chinese armored personnel carriers, Chinese missiles on the battlefield. So there is clearly a limit to that relationship. China doesn't want to suffer sanctions, doesn't want to suffer secondary sanctions. It knows the limits of what it can do, and it does support Russia, but it doesn't support it in a way that, say, North Korea does. It hasn't sent troops, it hasn't sent artillery, it hasn't sent missiles. So, it's dangerous, and obviously, China is only going to be emboldened by a Russian victory in Ukraine. It's only going to see Western weakness. It's not going to respect the strength of the US if they sell their Ukrainian friends down the river. If anything, it's going to look at Taiwan and think, well, okay, Russia got away with it in Taiwan, in Ukraine, so we can get away with it in Taiwan. We might suffer a little bit of economic pain in the short term, but long term, the West has no appetite to stand up for what it used to call core principles, core beliefs. So yeah, why not? But if you're the Chinese, you absolutely would question Western kind of values and Western strategic patience, if anything. And the Taiwanese know this as well. The Taiwanese have been very, very clear about that. They think that if Russia is successful in Ukraine, it will set a very, very bad example, and it will put their national security at risk. And they've said this multiple times. Nobody in Washington seems to be listening to them. But there we are.
Do you think that right now China is looking at the US thinking it's looking weak?
Yeah, they're looking at the US and thinking they're weak and they're stupid. That's what the Chinese are thinking. There's the Chinese were a lot of things, but the Chinese government is not stupid. They have strategic patience. They are willing to work slowly for their core strategic interests. They also view the US as hopelessly divided. There's no continuity between administrations. There used to be core American values that would have been held across Democratic and Republican administrations. You might have very, very differing views on, say, healthcare policy or what have you, but in foreign policy, you generally have core principles that both parties would agree to, like Atlanticism. You'd have they would both believe in the NATO alliance. They both believe in supporting allies. That seems to have gone out the window with Trump. If anything, he's more threatening to his allies than he is to America's adversaries. So yeah, the Chinese absolutely, again, they can't believe their luck. America's got this incredibly stupid, it's strategic stupidity. There's absolutely no strategic vision in the US. They're alienating all of their allies. And just today, Bloomberg was reporting that the Trump administration is asking European allies to extend restrictions on supplying chips to China. And you have to ask, well, why? Why would Europe agree to this unless we're getting something in return? Why would we follow why would we follow American policy on China if America is not going to pay any attention to what Europe wants in regards to Russia? This is why you have allies, so you can increase your relative power, and America needs allies just as much as anyone else.
Well, even after this meeting with Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump, Jimmy, it looked quite cordial as best as it could in a time of very tensions between anyone in the European Union and the United States. But from your perspective, does it look like, is the United States to be trusted right now by its allies?
No, absolutely not. You can't trust a country that is so erratic, that is so unpredictable, that is so belligerent towards its allies. You can't trust a country that talks about making Canada the 51st state, that talks about potentially using military force to annex Greenland. You just can't trust a country like that. And okay, we could hope in the future sanity prevails in Washington, and they remember the value of alliances, and they remember the value of NATO, and they remember the value of what they used to stand for, allegedly freedom, democracy, etc. But at the moment, we have to prepare for a world where we can't rely on the Americans, where a NATO Article 5 invocation by, say, Estonia would not be honoured by, Washington. They just potentially, we'd call and they wouldn't come. So we need to approach obtaining our strategic autonomy, in a realistic way. We need to invest in our defence industries. We need to boost defence spending. We need to potentially look at, across Europe, a pan-European nuclear deterrent. And these discussions are already taking place. They're already talking about this sort of stuff.
You're right. I think the takeaway from the last few weeks is that Europe needs to be able to stand on their own 2 feet without the reliance on the US. But Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.